For centuries, a single sentence in an ancient text has been wielded to, well, basically dictate domestic marriage rules.
Right.
It's been used to settle household disputes and completely define the social hierarchy of men and women.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you grew up in or around the Abrahamic traditions, you know exactly the kind of dusty, archaic framework I am talking about here.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone knows that framework.
You know, you open up a text, you flip to the chapters on family law, and you point to a verse and say, well, there it is. It's just a product of its ancient time.
Right, it's treated like a relic.
But what if we have been reading it completely wrong for 1,400 years?
That is the big question.
Like, what if this specific text, Surah An-Nisa, verse 1, isn't a domestic rule book at all? What if it is actually the highly technical biological blueprint for a state-run universal social security system?
A system that ensures literally no human being on Earth is left without sustenance.
Exactly. Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today, we are unpacking an absolutely massive paradigm shift.
It really is. It turns everything upside down.
We are looking at a fascinating stack of translated lecture notes and the socioeconomic analyses of the Quran by Allama G.A. Parwez.
And when you dive into Parwez's work, you realize very quickly that we're dealing with something fundamentally different than what traditional history has handed down to us.
Yeah, because we are essentially transitioning completely out of the realm of ancient mythology.
Right, and stepping directly into evolutionary biology and economics.
Which is wild for an ancient religious text. So the mission of our deep dive today is to totally upend how you view these scriptures.
Parwez basically argues that if you strip away all that cultural baggage, this isn't a collection of ancient Genesis fables at all.
It is a 21st century constitutional charter.
Exactly.
So we are taking this specific verse, Surah An-Nisa, which historically translates to the women, and we are going to unpack how Parwez completely shatters its traditional meaning.
But, you know, to understand how a text goes from being interpreted as a localized domestic diary to a universal manifesto for human rights, we really have to set the stage.
We have to look at the environment where those original interpretations were born, right?
Yeah, we have to look at what Parwez calls the intellectual vacuum of the Dark Ages.
Okay, so paint that picture for us.
Right.
What does that naive view look like?
Well, you have to put yourself in the mind of an early human, or even someone living in, say, the 7th or 8th centuries.
Right.
Think about the sheer cognitive limits of that era. I mean, humanity simply lacked the scientific capacity to grasp anything even resembling evolutionary biology.
They didn't have microscopes.
No microscopes, no fossil records, no understanding of genetics. You could not sit down with a scholar in the year 800 and explain cellular division.
Or inorganic chemical synthesis.
Exactly. The language for it literally did not exist. The conceptual framework was completely absent.
But, you know, human beings are relentlessly curious. I mean, it is our defining trait.
We always want to know the why and the how.
Right. We have always looked up at the stars or down at our own hands and asked, well, where did we come from? How did this all start?
And if you don't have modern science, you still need an answer to that question.
You have to fill the void somehow.
Which is exactly why these placeholder fables were invented. To fill that massive, terrifying intellectual void, various religious and cultural traditions formulated creation myths.
They needed a narrative that the ancient mind could actually comprehend.
Yeah. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, specifically through the book of Genesis, this took the form of a highly symbolic story.
The classic Adam and Eve story.
Right, a divine being molding a physical clay statue of a man, breathing life into it, and then literally extracting a woman from that man's rib.
It provided a very neat, comprehensible beginning.
It answered the how in a way that satisfied the intellectual capacity of the time. You know, it made sense to them.
I want to pause on that, though, because this is where the historical record gets incredibly complicated, especially for the specific text we are analyzing today.
Oh, it gets very messy.
Because, according to Parwez's linguistic analysis, the Quran itself fundamentally rejects this literal clay statue and the rib narrative.
It pushes back against it entirely.
And yet, if you go to a library right now and pull down the most famous, traditional, centuries-old Islamic commentaries on the Quran, you will find those exact same biblical fables written right there in the margins to explain the verses.
It is a massive contradiction.
How does a text that supposedly rejects these myths end up completely buried underneath them?
To answer that, we really have to look at the demographics of the early Islamic Empire and a massive historical blind spot.
Okay, break that down for us.
There is a crucial timeline here. The oral traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, what are known as the Hadith, were not systematically compiled and written down during his lifetime.
Wait, really? I think a lot of people assume they were written down immediately.
No, not at all. That massive compilation effort really took off about 200 to 250 years later.
During the Abbasid period, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, 2.5 centuries is an incredibly long time. That is like us trying to compile the exact verbatim daily conversations of George Washington today, based entirely on word of mouth.
It is practically impossible to do perfectly. And on top of that, the empire had changed drastically in those 2.5 centuries.
Right. It had expanded massively.
It had expanded at an unprecedented rate, absorbing vast, incredibly diverse populations.
So you had massive influxes of converts from Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Persian traditions, all suddenly entering this new Islamic framework.
Yes. And when millions of people adopt a new paradigm, they do not just wipe their mental hard drives clean.
They don't just forget everything they knew.
No. They bring their cultural baggage, their childhood stories, and their fundamental worldviews right along with them.
They brought their ancestral creation myths.
They absolutely did. And this created a huge sociological problem, like how do you legitimize these deeply ingrained cultural stories within a brand new Islamic framework?
Parwez points out a sort of historical infiltration that occurred here, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that the phrase, the Prophet said, or Qala Rasul Allah in Arabic, began to be attached to these imported stories.
So they basically stamped these ancient myths with a seal of prophetic approval.
Exactly. By appending that chain of narration to a Judeo-Christian fable, it was falsely elevated to the status of a sacred, unquestionable prophetic saying.
Wow. It is the ultimate historical game of telephone, but the stakes are incredibly high.
Because the moment someone slaps "the Prophet said this" onto a story about a clay statue, the whole dynamic changes.
Right. Questioning the logic of that story suddenly transforms from a simple intellectual debate into a theological crime.
You are no longer questioning a fable, you are accused of questioning the Prophet himself.
That is terrifying. It completely shuts down critical thinking.
That is the exact mechanism of the infiltration. And it heavily influenced the early Quranic commentators, the Mufassirin.
Scholars like Imam Tabari, right?
Yeah, Tabari was a brilliant historian, absolutely brilliant, but he operated entirely within the epistemological limits of his time.
So when Tabari and later scholars like Ibn Kathir, who summarized his work, came across verses in the Quran discussing the origins of humanity, they were stuck.
They didn't have modern biology to rely on, so they looked to the traditions circulating at the time.
They took these imported, stamped fables and used them as the definitive lens to translate and explain the Quranic text.
Precisely. And Parwez's notes highlight some of the specific details these commentators added. When you look at them through a modern logical lens, the paradoxes are just glaring.
And I want to be clear here for the listener, we aren't mocking these early scholars.
Not at all.
We are looking at Parwez's objective critique of how literalism distorts a text. For instance, Parwez points out how these early commentaries tried to force a cosmic, potentially multi-billion-year process of creation into a standard human week.
The human calendar projection is such a perfect example of this ancient mindset.
It's wild. What did they actually write?
The traditional commentaries actually claim that angels were created on a Wednesday, jinn on a Thursday, and Adam on a Friday.
But Wednesday.
Yeah, they took processes that we now understand involve incomprehensible stretches of space-time and mapped them onto a 7-day work week.
Just because that was the only scale of time they could conceptualize.
Exactly. It's all they knew.
And Parwez really zeroes in on the physical paradoxes of the clay statue narrative itself.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
According to the traditions that Tabari and others recorded, a literal physical clay statue of a man was formed and left lying in the mud for 40 days to dry.
Just baking in the sun.
Right. And during this drying period, Iblis Satan would wander by, inspect the statue, and physically kick it to see if it was hollow.
He kicked it.
Yeah, and the commentary says he found it hollow, went in through the mouth, and came out the other side.
It is an incredibly anthropomorphic view of both the divine and the metaphysical.
It's like a cartoon.
It really reduces profound cosmic concepts to physical, tangible interactions. And Parwez notes that it gets even more paradoxical when the tradition describes the soul actually entering the body.
How does that work in the myth?
Well, the narrative claims the divine breath entered through the statue's head, and as it slowly moved downward, the dry clay began turning into flesh and blood.
Okay, top down.
Right. But because the figure of Adam was supposedly hasty by nature, he tried to stand up before the soul had reached his legs.
So you literally have a physical paradox of a man trying to stand on legs that are still brittle, dry clay.
It shatters the logic completely. It is a fascinating look into how the ancient mind tried to mechanize a spiritual concept.
The Parwez argues that the theological gymnastics really reached their peak when the scholars tried to explain the creation of the woman from the rib.
Yes, specifically because they ran into a massive problem with the Christian concept of original sin.
This is a crucial point of divergence, right?
Absolutely. In Christian theology, the concept of original sin is deeply intertwined with the actions of Adam and Eve in the garden.
But traditional Islamic scholars had a different theological framework.
They wanted to strictly avoid any implication that the initial relationship between Adam and Eve in this celestial garden was somehow illicit or inappropriate.
Because they hadn't been cast down to earth yet.
Right. They needed to legitimize the biological pairing retroactively.
And Parwez highlights how later scholars, like Maulana Edisham ul-Haq Thanvi, invented these incredibly elaborate, bizarre celestial solutions to fix this plot hole.
The celestial marriage contract?
Yes. According to this traditional narrative, Adam was actually forbidden from touching Eve in heaven until a formal Islamic marriage contract, a nikah, took place right there in the celestial realm.
Which is just a complete anachronism.
It makes no sense.
It is the projection of medieval Islamic jurisprudence laws developed centuries later for human societies on Earth onto a primordial, non-physical creation myth.
It goes even further, though. The narrative claims that Adam couldn't just have the marriage contract, he had to pay a bridal dowry, a mar.
Right, because earthly laws require a dowry.
But since he didn't have any physical currency in heaven, the tradition states his dowry was to send formal blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad 10 times.
With angels standing by, acting as the legal witnesses to the marriage.
It is so incredibly specific to medieval society.
When Parwez isolates these stories, he isn't just pointing out their lack of scientific merit. He is diagnosing a catastrophic intellectual paralysis.
Because these stories became the unquestioned bedrock of faith for centuries.
Exactly.
You know, it makes me think of a modern society completely refusing to update its operating system because the outdated code has been labeled sacred.
That is a perfect analogy.
You have this old, clunky, buggy software from the Dark Ages running the hardware of a modern civilization. And because these myths were falsely tied to the prophet through those chains of narration, questioning the bugs in the software was seen as blasphemy.
It's completely shut down independent scientific reflection.
Believers were fundamentally conditioned to believe they did not have the authority to use their own intellect to reflect on the text.
Because the early scholars had supposedly finalized all the answers 1,000 years ago, there was nothing left to think about.
That stagnant mindset is exactly what Parwez is attacking here.
He argues that the Quran itself demands the exact opposite approach. It does not ask for blind adherence to ancient commentators. It demands rigorous, constant intellectual inquiry.
Parwez points to verses suggesting that as human scientific knowledge elevates, the true, deeply encoded meaning of its verses will naturally become apparent.
The text was designed to unfold alongside human intellect, not to be anchored to the 7th century.
So, if we agree with Parwez's premise, how do we actually clear out the outdated software? How do we reboot the system?
We have to go back to the source code.
We have to look at the actual linguistic roots of the Arabic text through a modern scientific lens.
Yes, we need to look at the biological architecture that Parwez claims is hiding in plain sight.
Let's do it. If we discard the mythological translations, Parwez argues the vocabulary of Surah An-Nisa reveals a highly technical, evolutionary timeline.
It really does. When Parwez applies the concept of mafhum, which means the deep root meaning of the words rather than their colloquial historical usage, he reveals something incredible.
An origin story that aligns astonishingly well with modern scientific discoveries regarding the origin of life from inorganic matter.
Let's test that. Let's look at the Arabic word teen.
Okay, if I go to a bookstore today, pull down a standard translation of the Quran, and look up the creation verses, teen is almost universally translated as clay.
Literally the wet dirt you use to mold a coffee mug.
Right. But Parwez guides us to a massive scientific semantic shift here. He argues that in the specific biological context, teen is not a molded clay statue at all.
No, it means inorganic matter.
That shift in definition changes everything.
It really does. Teen represents the base chemical elements of the earth matter that is entirely, completely devoid of life. It is the sterile foundation.
And Parwez connects this to another explicit statement in the text. We made from water every living thing.
Right. Life on the surface of the Earth officially commenced from water interacting with this lifeless inorganic matter.
It did not spontaneously pop out of dry dirt as a fully formed bipedal human being.
It requires a synthesis, requires a chemical reaction.
Parwez notes describe a process using the term amal takmir. My Arabic is a little rusty, but doesn't the root of that word relate to brewing or baking?
You are spot on. Amal takmir translates directly to the fermentation process.
Fermentation, like
Yeah.
literal chemical fermentation.
Yes. Think about the conditions of a prehistoric Earth. You have lifeless inorganic matter, the teen.
Okay.
Water mixes with it. But wet dirt alone doesn't create life. It needs a catalyst.
It needs ambient, continuous solar heat over vast, incomprehensible periods of time.
Exactly. So when water mixes with this lifeless inorganic matter and it bakes under the sun, it begins to ferment.
Parwez points to the Arabic term used in the text, hamay in maznin,
And the traditional commentators looked at that word and thought, well, okay, it means stinky mud.
because fermenting things smell bad.
Right. But Parwez says it translates perfectly to an odorous, fermenting black mud.
It is the exact description of the primordial soup.
It is a chemically rich, transforming environment. And as this fermenting mud ages, as it slowly loses its moisture under the relentless solar heat, it transitions into another distinct state.
The Quranic term for this stage is salsalin kalfakar.
And this is the specific term that those early traditionalists we talked about earlier completely misunderstood.
How did they translate salsalin kalfakar?
They translated it as a literal, hollow-sounding clay doll.
The very doll that Satan supposedly kicked to see if it echoed.
Exactly. Because they didn't understand the chemistry of fermentation and desiccation, they assumed it meant baked pottery.
Wow.
But Parwez argues that scientifically, salsalin kalfakar denotes the crusty, drying, nutrient-rich composition where the very first living cell takes definitive physical form.
The environmental synthesis of inorganic matter, water, heat, and time produces the first microscopic spark of life.
Which brings us to arguably the biggest revelation in Parwez's entire socioeconomic framework.
The term Nafsin Wahidah.
Yes. Which appears right at the beginning of Surah An-Nisa.
If you look at those standard translations again, Nafsin Wahidah is almost always labeled simply as the mythological person Adam.
But Parvez asserts that technically, linguistically, and biologically, it means the original life cell.
The single germ of life.
The translation of Nafsin Wahidah as a singular mythological man is the root of the entire misunderstanding of the surah.
That is a huge claim.
Parwez defines it as the singular microscopic biological entity from which all complex life eventually evolved.
Structurally, it represents a basic biological cell containing a nucleus and cytoplasm.
And within that single microscopic nucleus was encapsulated all the massive evolutionary potential for the future of the species.
I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the mechanics of this because it is so incredibly removed from the standard Adam and Eve story.
Let's break it down further.
Let me try an analogy here. If we think about baking sourdough bread, you don't just magically pull a loaf of bread out of thin air.
No, you need ingredients.
You need flour, which represents our inorganic matter, our teen.
Right.
You need water. And you need ambient heat in your kitchen. You mix them together, you let them sit, and they undergo amali takmir. They ferment.
They become active.
You create a living starter culture, that bubbling microscopic ecosystem sitting in a glass jar on your counter. That is your Nafsin Wahidah.
That is a brilliant way to picture it.
It is the living cell born from entirely lifeless ingredients that now possesses the biological potential to grow, divide, and sustain a whole new structure.
That analogy captures the essence perfectly. The Nafsin Wahidah is the sourdough starter of biological life on Earth.
At its inception, this original life cell existed as a singular, independent entity.
It had not yet developed biological distinctions like male or female. It was just life in its most basic, undivided form.
But, you know, a single cell sitting in a primordial puddle is just a single cell.
It doesn't do much on its own.
A starter in a jar doesn't do anything unless it is activated, unless it multiplies. How does Parwez explain the leap from a microscopic dot in the fermenting mud to the diverse, complex, bipedal human beings tuning into this deep dive today?
To understand that leap, we have to look at how Parwez deconstructs the concept of the evolutionary split. We have to move from one to many.
Okay, how does he do that?
This requires us to dismantle another massive mythological pillar, the rib story.
Right, the extraction of Eve.
Traditionally, in Surah An-Nisa, the Arabic word zawj has been translated simply as wife. hence the imported biblical story of Eve being pulled from Adam's rib to be his companion.
Wait, if I look up zawj in an Arabic dictionary right now, it usually refers to a spouse, right?
Commonly, yes.
How does Parwez justify stripping away the marital definition entirely?
By looking at how the word is used across the entirety of the text, not just in human contexts.
Oh, interesting.
Parwez notes that the Quran uses the root of zawj to describe everything from plants to cosmic phenomena.
So it's a broader scientific term.
Exactly. In its purest linguistic form, zawj does not mean a biological wife pulled from a rib. It denotes a complementary pair. It is about binary systems.
So applied to our single cell, our Nafsin Wahidah.
Applied to the Nafsin Wahidah, it describes cellular division.
Mitosis.
Yes, driven by natural environmental factors and the divine law of development, that original life cell eventually absorbed enough energy to undergo mitosis. It split.
It divided into two complementary parts.
Known in modern biology as sister cells or daughter cells.
And neither of those new cells could function fully without the other. They were entirely structurally interdependent for the continuation of life.
Precisely. This is the exact evolutionary stage required to propagate life. The text refers to this microscopic splitting of the Nafsin Wahidah as the creation of its zawj.
It is a biological description of binary fission, not a surgical extraction of a bone.
It really is.
It is genuinely mind-blowing to consider a text from the 7th century utilizing vocabulary that so seamlessly maps onto the splitting of a single cell into interdependent sister cells.
It's way ahead of its time.
But even after that split, humanity didn't just appear instantly, right? Parwez points out that the text describes a massive passage of time.
Yes, a very long timeline. The Arabic word used is idwara, which signifies evolutionary stages.
So it wasn't an overnight process.
Not at all. The timeline mapped out in Parwez's analysis suggests that the descendants of that splitting cell progressed through these idwara over millions of years.
Moving from water to land, surviving diverse environments, adapting through natural selection.
And eventually acquiring the complex physical form we recognize today. Parwez notes that even right now, within our own bodies, 50 million cells die and are reborn every single second.
We are walking, breathing manifestations of a continuous evolutionary process that started in that mud.
Exactly.
When you lay it out like that, the parallels to Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species are unavoidable.
They are very striking.
It is incredibly profound that the evolutionary tree of life concept, the fundamental idea that all complex life branches out from a single shared microscopic origin, was linguistically encoded in this text centuries before Darwin ever boarded the HMS Beagle.
It lays out precise biological staging. Inorganic matter, water, heat, fermentation, single-cell, cellular division, and vast stages of adaptation.
And it is within this vast timeline of multiplication and spread across the earth that Parwez redefines two of the most misunderstood words in the text, Riyal and Nisa.
This is where we get back to the traditional marriage rules assumption.
Right. Traditionally, Riyal translates to men and Nisa translates to women, and they have been used to establish rigid patriarchal hierarchies with strict social roles assigned to each.
But within Parwez's biological and evolutionary framework, they mean something much broader.
What do they actually mean then?
They denote the massive evolutionary multiplication of the human species. The root of Riyal relates to being on foot, moving, spreading out.
It implies the active expansion of humanity across the globe. And Nisa. If the whole surah is named An-Nisa, and it doesn't just mean the women in your house, what does it mean?
Parwez introduces a critical shift in the mafhum, the real meaning of Nisa.
Okay.
Rather than just referring to biological women in a domestic subordinate sense, Nisa is framed as a functional group within the society that requires structural protection and care due to the burdens they bear.
What kind of burdens?
Specifically, the massive biological and societal burden of propagating the species.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. When the text addresses Rihal and Nisa, it is not handing down a chore chart for a husband and wife.
It is addressing the entirety of the vast, diverse human population that sprouted from that original cellular division, emphasizing their profound interconnectedness.
Exactly. It's a societal mandate, not a domestic one.
Parwez also expands on other terms in this verse, like the word for orphans.
Yes, the term yatama.
In traditional translations, it just means children who have lost their parents. But the new focus of this socioeconomic interpretation broadens it significantly, doesn't it?
It does. Parwez argues that the term for orphans actually encompasses anyone who is left alone in the struggle of life.
Anyone who lacks a support system.
Anyone marginalized by the economy, anyone vulnerable. The text is categorizing humanity not by rigid gender roles, but by those who are expanding the society and those who require the society's structural protection to survive.
Which sets up the ultimate question of this entire analysis. Why is an ancient religious text giving us a highly technical biology lesson?
It's a great question.
Why spend so much time establishing definitively that we evolved from fermenting mud and a single splitting cell?
Because, according to Parwez, that shared biological origin is the absolute unshakable foundation for a radical economic mandate.
We are moving from the biological architecture into the economic engine.
Yes, what Parwez calls the Nizam-e-Rubiyat.
This is the leap from science to social justice. If you can scientifically prove that every single human being on Earth, regardless of their race, their social class, their bank account, or their gender, originates from the exact same microscopic cellular starting point,
You construct an argument for human equality that cannot be debated.
it completely dismantles any philosophical or biological claim to inherent superiority.
A king and a peasant share the exact same Nafsin Wahidah.
And this shared equal origin introduces the next massive linguistic key in Surah An-Nisa, the concept of tasalun.
This is a really important shift in translation.
I know that traditionally the root of this word, su'al, has been translated as asking or even begging, as in asking someone for charity.
But Parwez shifts the translation entirely. Based on the biological context we just established, he translates tasalun as mutual dependency.
Meaning it is a statement of biological fact. No human can survive independently.
Correct. Every individual is inherently structurally reliant on the collective society to meet their needs.
Think about your day-to-day to the listener. You didn't build the roads you drove on.
You didn't grow, harvest, and transport the food you ate.
You didn't synthesize the medicine you might take. We are a deeply interdependent species.
We survive only through the division of labor and mutual support.
And Parwez points out that this mutual dependency begins in the Al-Arham.
Now, Al-Arham is usually translated strictly as biological wombs or blood kinship.
Respect the wombs that bore you is how it usually reads in English translations.
Okay, but in Parwez's socioeconomic framework, Al-Arham represents the foundational family unit, the home.
It acts as the primary starting block for creating a cooperative social order.
Right. A baby learns mutual dependency and care in the home, but the mandate here is that this localized care must eventually expand outward to encompass all of humanity.
So how does this translate into macroeconomics? Parwez uses a really evocative metaphor here, the tree of life metaphor, to explain the core injunction of the text, which is itaku rabbakum.
Itaku rabbakum is the supreme command here. It means to guard and establish the divine laws of sustenance, the rubuya.
How does the tree metaphor work?
Well, if we visualize Parwez's tree of life, if all of humanity grew from one cellular seed, the Nafs, then every single human being alive today is a branch on the exact same tree.
And the institutional blueprint derived from this biology dictates a very specific rule for the tree.
Exactly.
No single branch is permitted to suck up all the water, blood, and nutrients from the roots just to keep itself lush and green, while deliberately allowing the rest of the branches on the tree to wither, dry up, and die.
It is an absolute non-negotiable mandate against the concentration of wealth.
The resources of the earth, which, by the way, originated from the exact same inorganic matter as humanity itself, must sustain the entire organism equally.
Society must operate like a flourishing, balanced garden, where the laws of sustenance apply to every single component.
In this framework, hoarding wealth is not treated just as a minor moral failing.
No, it is an unnatural biological anomaly. It is a cancer within the organism.
Parwez specifically ties this to the rules of inheritance and wealth distribution in the subsequent verses, doesn't he?
He does.
It's not just about who gets what percentage of an estate. It's a mechanism to prevent wealth concentration.
Exactly. The complex inheritance laws that follow in Surah An-Nisa, which people often find mathematically tedious, are actually anti-hoarding mechanisms.
They are designed to forcibly break up concentrated pools of wealth and distribute them back into the broader society,
ensuring the rububiyah, the nourishment and sustenance of all parts of the social organism.
If we look at today's society like a human body, Parwez's interpretation paints a very grim picture of modern capitalism.
It's a devastating critique.
Billionaires hoarding unimaginable wealth while people starve in the streets is like the brain deciding to hoard all the blood and oxygen for itself, letting the arms and legs undergo necrosis and rot.
And what happens when the limbs rot?
Eventually, the infection from the rotting limbs spreads, the heart stops, and the society dies. The brain does not survive the death of the body it destroyed.
That is a stark, mathematically accurate mapping of Parwez's concept. Because citizens are biologically and socially interdependent, Parwez argues this framework maps flawlessly onto a mandate for a 21st century state-run universal social security system.
It means the central authority, the state, must institutionalize mutual aid.
It has to be institutionalized.
I want to emphasize that because it is a huge distinction. This is not about charity. This is not about tossing a few coins to a beggar on the street so you can feel good about your own generosity.
No, charity implies a power dynamic. Charity is voluntary. Parwez argues this is a structural evolutionary imperative to ensure the socioeconomic rights of all.
It is a structural guarantee.
It completely reorients the text from a book of ritualistic dogma and personal piety into a manual for institutional justice.
The state is strictly obligated to guarantee these rights because mutual dependency tasaloon is hardwired into our biology.
Right.
But humans are notoriously stubborn, selfish creatures. What happens if a society simply ignores this mandate?
That's where things get dark.
What if the branches decide they really want to be selfish? What if the brain decides it really likes having all the blood and doesn't care about the limbs?
Parwez doesn't just outline the utopia, he outlines the consequences, which brings us to the concept of social physics and the law of requital.
Okay, social physics. Explain that.
To understand the consequences of hoarding, we have to look at how Parwez distinguishes between biological instinct and human intellect.
Right.
In the evolutionary framework he outlines, humanity passed through stages over millions of years, and eventually we crossed the threshold. We were granted something unique in the animal kingdom.
Conscious intellect, free will, and the power of choice.
Exactly. Animals operate purely on biological instinct.
The lecture notes use a really great simple analogy to explain this difference, the goat analogy.
I love that analogy.
If you have a baby goat and you put it in a field with just basic physical food and water, it naturally grows up to become a fully functioning goat.
It instinctively knows how to graze, how to run, how to interact with the herd.
It doesn't need to go to goat school to learn its role. Its biological programming dictates its behavior perfectly.
But a human baby is entirely different. A human is born incredibly vulnerable and unprogrammed.
If you give a human baby only physical food, water, and shelter, and you completely isolate it,
leaving it alone without any social interaction, language, emotional connection, or education, it does not magically become a functional, contributing human being.
It would be feral. It would be functionally an animal.
Exactly. Because humans require socio-educational nourishment. They require conscious integration into a society.
They require shared knowledge, moral frameworks, and structural support to actualize their human potential.
We're not designed to operate purely on the physical survival instincts of the jungle.
And this introduces what Parwez calls the social physics of the text, specifically the law of requital.
It is a harsh reality, but it is the ultimate consequence of the system.
If a society abandons its intellectual and socioeconomic responsibilities, if a civilization decides that people are just going to hoard resources, breed, eat, and die based on blind, selfish animal instinct without providing collective nourishment to the vulnerable,
they fundamentally betray their evolutionary purpose.
Parwez posits that this regression into animalism, where a society operates on the principle of survival of the fittest, where the strong exploit the weak without consequence, directly triggers the law of requital.
It is the social physics equivalent to gravity or thermodynamics.
If you drop a glass, it shatters.
If a society mistreats its weak and hoards its resources in a few concentrated nodes, it inevitably triggers physical and moral decay across the entire system.
It condemns the community to a living hell. And Parwez is very clear that he's not necessarily talking about a fiery pit in the afterlife.
No, he's talking about a literal, systemic, socioeconomic collapse right here on Earth.
Social chaos, soaring crime rates, violent revolution, environmental degradation, and ultimate destruction.
Mistreatment of those left alone in the struggle of life isn't just bad moral behavior that gets you a demerit point in heaven.
It is a literal violation of natural law. And natural law always, eventually, balances the equation.
It is an unavoidable physical consequence. When one part of the social organism is deprived, the whole organism inevitably suffers the blowback.
Hoarding and exploitation are fundamentally mathematically unsustainable systems,
They lead to their own collapse under divine physical laws.
which makes Parwez's analysis incredibly relevant today. So I want to pose a direct question to you, the listener.
It's a tough question to ask.
What stands out to you when you look at the staggering wealth disparities in the world right now? When you see billionaires launching private rockets into orbit while millions of people in their own cities lack clean water and basic health care?
Are we functioning as a single, interdependent organism?
Or are we regressing into the blind, selfish animalism that Parwez says this text warns about? Are we acting like the brain hoarding the blood while the limbs rot?
It is a profound, deeply uncomfortable diagnostic question for modern civilization.
It really is. And it brings us to the synthesis of Parwez's entire argument. We started this deep dive looking at Surah An-Nisa, verse 1.
A text that, for centuries, has been historically used to enforce rigid domestic rules, gendered hierarchies, and localized family law.
All filtered through the imported mythological fables of ancient commentators. But by stripping away the mythology, looking at the pure linguistic roots, and applying an evolutionary biological lens,
Parwez reveals it as something entirely different. It is a universal manifesto for human rights.
Parwez identifies a core permanent value here, a mustakela kadar.
He establishes that human dignity and social equity aren't just polite moral suggestions or voluntary charity.
They are structural imperatives hardwired into our shared microscopic biological origin, our Nafsin Wahidah.
Because we genuinely share that single origin point, we share an undeniable, inescapable mutual dependency.
Which leaves you with something very real to chew on long after this conversation ends. Think about the invisible threads connecting you to the rest of the organism.
Think about the person bagging your groceries today.
Think about the underpaid worker manufacturing your smartphone on the other side of the world. Think about the very inorganic matter beneath your feet.
If we all sprouted from the exact same fermenting cell, from the exact same water and clay,
Who exactly are you competing against? We are just branches of the exact same tree fighting over the same sunlight.
if we hoard from each other, we're only fighting and starving ourselves.
Exactly. But here's the final tease, because a philosophy without structural execution is just nice poetry.
We need actual mechanics.
We have seen today how this incredible biological system conceptually protects the individual and mandates universal sustenance. We know we are scientifically supposed to share the nutrients.
Right.
But how does this text define the actual authority, what Parwez calls the markaz, that must physically enforce these rights on a state level?
Who is actually in charge of managing the tree and making sure the strongest branches don't hoard all the sap?
That requires moving from biological theory into the structural reality of governance and political authority.
And that is exactly where Parwez's analysis goes next.
I cannot wait to unpack the concept of the markaz. Thank you for exploring the roots of this incredible text with us today. Keep questioning the old software, and we will see you next time.